Tonight, let us settle into a quieter corner of history, one that is often spoken about in hurried headlines but rarely explored with patience or stillness. As the evening light softens and the world outside grows calm, I invite you to rest here with me as we begin tonight's story, the history of drug cartels in Venezuela. This is not a tale that unfolds all at once. It moves slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, shaped by geography, politics, and moments of silence as much as by moments of noise. Venezuela, with its long Caribbean coastline, dense jungles, winding rivers, and vast borders, did not begin as a center of the global drug trade. For much of the 20th century, it stood slightly to the side, watching as neighboring routes carried illicit goods northward. But history has a way of drifting, like mist over warm ground, and in time those routes shifted. As we ease into this story, I will guide you gently, without urgency. We will trace how Venezuela's position between the Andean cocaine producers of Colombia and the open waters of the Caribbean gradually transformed it into a corridor, and later into something more complex. This transformation did not happen overnight. It occurred through small changes in enforcement, political priorities, and global demand. It unfolded quietly, sometimes unnoticed, until its presence could no longer be ignored. In the hush of the evening, we will also reflect on how power and profit intertwine. We will encounter moments where institutions weakened, where corruption seeped in softly rather than crashing through the door. Over time, networks formed that blurred the lines between traffickers, military figures, and political authority. Names emerged, whispered at first, then spoken aloud in courtrooms and international reports. Figures like Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro appear in this story not as singular causes, but as part of a broader atmosphere where control, loyalty, and survival shape decisions. Yet this story is not only about crime or power. It is also about ordinary lives lived beneath these systems. Dock workers, farmers, border villagers, and city residents all moved through days that looked deceptively normal. Markets opened. Children went to school. Radios played softly in the background. And beneath it all, unseen currents flowed, carrying consequences that would surface years later. As background historian, I will not rush you through this landscape. We will move slowly, allowing details to settle like dust in lamplight. We will pause often, letting the weight of history rest gently rather than press heavily. There is no need to remember every name or date. Simply let the narrative pass by, steady and calm, like a river moving through the dark. In the stillness that follows this beginning, we will drift into part 1, where the foundations are laid and Venezuela's early role as a transit nation quietly takes shape. For now, breathe easily, settle deeper into rest, and let tonight's story unfold at its own unhurried pace. Part 1. A country on the edge of the roots. As we drift gently into the first part of tonight's story, let us step back into a quieter time, before headlines, before urgency, before the word cartel carried the weight it does now. I want you to imagine Venezuela not as a problem to be solved, but as a place resting peacefully between worlds. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela was not known as a center of the drug trade. It was known for oil, for wide skies, for music drifting from open windows, for ports that carried legal goods and stories from distant shores. Its long Caribbean coastline stretched calmly northward, touching warm waters that had carried merchants and sailors for centuries. Inland, jungles breathed slowly, and rivers like the Orinoco moved with patient certainty toward the sea. To the west lay Colombia, where the foundations of the modern cocaine trade were beginning to take shape in the mid-20th century. Coca leaves had been cultivated for generations, but global demand changed everything. What had once been local, limited, and culturally specific became industrial, international, and enormously profitable. As production increased, traffickers searched for paths outward, routes that felt quieter, less watched, less burdened by law enforcement pressure. Venezuela, at first, was simply nearby. In these early years, the country functioned as a corridor rather than a command center. Drugs passed through rather than originated there. Small aircraft crossed borders that were difficult to patrol. Boats slipped quietly from coves into open water. Trucks moved across long, porous land borders where geography often mattered more than paperwork. None of this happened with sudden violence. It happened gradually, through opportunity and neglect, through spaces left unguarded. What makes this period important is not what Venezuela was doing loudly, but what it was not doing forcefully. Institutions existed. Laws were written. Police wore uniforms and soldiers patrolled checkpoints. Yet enforcement was inconsistent, stretched thin by terrain and distance. Corruption did not arrive as a storm. It arrived as a whisper. A favor here. A payment there. A blind eye turned for a moment that stretched into years. During this time, Venezuela's government was still relatively stable compared to what would come later. Oil revenue supported public services. Cities grew. There was little sense among the general population that the country was becoming entangled in something vast and dangerous. For many, the drug trade felt distant, something happening elsewhere, something that passed through shadows at the edges of national life. And yet, the routes were forming. Traffickers learned which airstrips were rarely used, which ports lacked thorough inspections, which officials could be persuaded with money rather than threats. These were not massive organizations yet. They were networks. Fluid, adaptable, quietly learning the landscape. Venezuela's geography taught them well. The Caribbean Sea, calm on the surface, offered countless exits. From there, drugs could move toward Central America, toward islands, toward the distant pull of the United States. Venezuela's ports, designed for oil and commerce, became silent partners in this movement. Containers were sealed. Paperwork was stamped. Ships departed under starlit skies. What is striking about this era is how ordinary it felt to those living within it. Farmers rose with the sun. Dock workers unloaded cargo. Children played in streets that echoed with laughter and radios. The machinery of daily life continued without interruption, even as something invisible threaded itself through the country's infrastructure. As background historian, I often find that history's most powerful shifts begin this way. Not with declarations or alarms, but with habits. With patterns that repeat until they feel normal. Venezuela's role as a transit nation became one of those patterns. It was useful. It was profitable for some. And it was easy to ignore. International attention remained focused elsewhere. Colombia drew the world's gaze. Mexico would soon follow. Venezuela stayed just out of frame, present but unexamined. This absence of scrutiny allowed the early networks to deepen. Relationships formed between traffickers and local power holders. Not always through violence, but through mutual benefit. By the late 20th century, Venezuela was no longer merely a passageway. It had become familiar terrain for illicit trade. The routes were tested. The methods refined. The silence, once accidental, became intentional. As we rest here at the close of part 1, let that idea settle gently. Venezuela did not fall suddenly into cartel influence. It drifted there, carried by geography, opportunity, and quiet decisions made far from public view. In the stillness of this beginning, the foundations were laid. In the calm that follows, we will soon move onward, into a time when politics and power begin to reshape these networks, and the corridor slowly transforms into something far more entangled. For now, let the night remain soft, and allow this early chapter to fade slowly into rest. Part 2. Power, Protection, and the Quiet Shift. As we move a little further into the night, the air grows stiller, and the story deepens. The roots we traced in the last chapter do not disappear. Instead, they settle into place, becoming familiar pathways beneath the surface of national life. In this part, we begin to feel a subtle shift. The moment when passage turns into protection, and when silence begins to serve power. By the late 20th century, Venezuela was changing, though not always in ways that were easy to see. Oil wealth continued to shape the country's rhythm. Government buildings stood solid and calm. Military uniforms signaled authority and order. On the surface, the state appeared intact. But within its structures, small fractures were forming, not from sudden collapse, but from gradual rearrangement. The drug trade, still largely flowing outward from Colombia, had learned something essential. Roots survive best when they are protected, not just hidden. And protection, in a modern state, often comes from proximity to authority. This did not require complete control. It required access. A phone number. A favor returned. A checkpoint delayed just long enough for a vehicle to pass. What emerged during this period was not yet a cartel state, but a system of coexistence. Traffickers and officials did not always see themselves as partners. Often, they saw themselves as separate actors benefiting from the same arrangement. Money flowed upward. Stability flowed downward. Each side believed it was managing the other. The military played a quiet role in this transition. Venezuela's armed forces were respected, structured, and deeply embedded in national identity. Control of airspace, ports, and borders naturally placed them near the arteries of trade, legal and illegal alike. In some cases, officers encountered trafficking and resisted it. In others, they tolerated it. And in a growing number, they found ways to profit from it without drawing attention. This was not chaos. It was order reshaped. Political life, too, began to shift. Public trust in traditional elites weakened. Economic inequality, though cushioned by oil revenue, never fully disappeared. Many Venezuelans felt distant from the decisions made in Caracas. This distance created space. Space for alternative loyalties. Space for quiet agreements that felt practical rather than criminal. When Hugo Chavez rose to power at the end of the century, he did not inherit a drug state. He inherited a landscape where institutions were already porous. His movement promised change, dignity, and independence from foreign influence. For many, this message felt grounding and hopeful. For others, it felt unsettling. Under Chavez, the relationship between the state and the military deepened. Officers gained influence, resources, and visibility. This consolidation of power created clarity at the top, but ambiguity below. Oversight weakened as loyalty became more valuable than transparency. In such an environment, illicit networks did not need to conquer institutions. They only needed to adapt to them. During these years, Venezuela's role in the drug trade quietly expanded. Trafficking was no longer just tolerated along the margins. It became entangled with governance itself. Not openly, not officially, but structurally. Routes remained active. Ports remained calm. Flights continued to depart under night skies. To ordinary citizens, daily life still unfolded with familiar routines. Markets opened. Buses ran late. Music drifted through warm evenings. The drug trade remained something spoken about in rumors, not something seen directly. This invisibility was its greatest strength. International attention, once again, looked elsewhere. Venezuela's political drama drew headlines, while its role in narcotics logistics stayed in the background. And so the system matured. Relationships hardened into expectations. Expectations settled into norms. As we rest at the end of Part 2, notice how little noise accompanied this transformation. No single moment marked the shift from corridor to collaborator. It happened through patience, proximity, and power aligning quietly in the dark. In the stillness that follows, we will drift into a period where these arrangements grow heavier, more centralized, and harder to ignore. For now, let the night remain gentle, and allow this chapter to fade, like lights dimming in distant government halls. Part 3. From networks to structure. As the night deepens, the story settles into a slower, heavier rhythm. What once moved loosely now begins to take shape. The quiet arrangements of the past chapters do not vanish. They tighten. They organize. They begin to resemble something durable. By the early years of the new century, Venezuela had crossed an invisible threshold. Trafficking was no longer only about passing through. It was about coordination. About assurance. About knowing that a route would remain open tomorrow, and the day after, and the year after that. I often think of this moment as the point where improvisation gives way to routine. Flights no longer relied on chance. Airstrips were selected with care. Cargo containers moved with predictable timing. Border crossings followed familiar patterns, not hurried escapes. The drug trade, once opportunistic, had learned to behave like infrastructure. This change did not require loud commands. It required alignment. Within the state, authority was becoming increasingly centralized. Loyalty mattered more than procedure. Oversight thinned as power consolidated. This environment was not uniquely criminal, but it was uniquely accommodating. When rules depend on allegiance rather than transparency, those who operate quietly thrive. Military influence continued to expand, particularly in areas tied to logistics. Control of ports, airports, and borders placed certain figures in positions of quiet leverage. Some resisted involvement. Others tolerated it. And a smaller, more consequential group began to manage it. Not always as traffickers themselves, but as guarantors. As protectors of movement. It was during this period that the phrase Cartel of the Suns began to circulate in whispers. The name referred not to a single organization in the traditional sense, but to an arrangement. A constellation of military figures, political protection, and trafficking routes that operated with shared interest rather than strict hierarchy. What makes this structure distinct is its subtlety. Unlike the highly visible cartels elsewhere in the region, this system did not rely on spectacle. There were no public displays of power meant to intimidate civilians. Violence existed, but it was selective, often hidden from public view. The goal was stability, not fear. From the outside, Venezuela still appeared orderly. Government buildings stood firm. Speeches were delivered. Elections were held. But beneath this surface, parallel systems were reinforcing one another. Political survival depended on loyalty. Loyalty depended on resources. And resources increasingly flowed through illicit channels. The geography that once merely allowed transit now encouraged settlement. Jungle airstrips became familiar. Coastal routes grew refined. The Caribbean, calm and expansive, offered countless exits. Venezuela's role in the global drug trade shifted again, from corridor to coordinator. And yet, for most people, life continued quietly. Families gathered in the evenings. Shops opened each morning. News reports focused on politics, shortages, and ideology. The deeper entanglement remained largely unspoken, not because it was unknown, but because it felt unreachable. This is an important truth to rest with. Systems of power do not always announce themselves. Often, they become real only when they begin to fail. Until then, they feel distant, abstract, like something happening far above or far away. As background historian, I find this period especially hushed. Not because nothing happened, but because everything happened softly. Decisions made behind closed doors. Routes secured without signatures. Protections granted without records. As Part 3 comes to a close, let this sense of quiet structure linger. The networks are no longer loose threads. They are woven into the fabric of the state itself. In the stillness that follows, we will drift into a time when economic collapse and international pressure begin to strain these arrangements, drawing them closer to the surface. For now, let the night remain calm, and allow this chapter to settle gently into rest. Part 4. Collapse, Opportunity, and the Weight of Silence. As we continue softly onward, the night feels heavier now, as though the air itself carries the weight of what is coming. The structures we observed in the last chapter remain standing, but they begin to creak. Not from sudden impact, but from strain. This is the moment when economic collapse and illicit power begin to lean fully into one another. By the middle of the 2010s, Venezuela entered a period of profound economic unraveling. Oil revenues declined. Mismanagement compounded long-standing weaknesses. Inflation rose until numbers lost meaning. Shelves emptied. Electricity flickered. Everyday routines became fragile, unpredictable things. In moments like these, informal systems often replace formal ones. People trade favors instead of currency. Authority shifts from institutions to individuals who can provide certainty. And in this environment, the structures tied to the drug trade did not collapse. They adapted. Illicit networks are, by nature, flexible. Where official salaries lost value overnight, smuggling profits remained tied to foreign currency. Where state supply chains failed, trafficking routes still delivered. This imbalance gave criminal infrastructure an unexpected role. It became one of the few systems still capable of moving goods reliably. Borders, once lines on a map, turned into lifelines. Smuggling expanded beyond drugs to include fuel, food, medicine, and people. The same routes that carried cocaine northward now carried gasoline outward and basic supplies inward. Everything moved quietly, negotiated at checkpoints rather than regulated by law. Political power tightened during this period. Under Nicolas Maduro, the state became more defensive, more insulated, and more dependent on loyal security forces. International sanctions followed, isolating the country further. These pressures did not eliminate illicit trade. They made it essential. When formal economies close, informal ones grow dense. This is where the earlier arrangements hardened. Military and political figures who once tolerated trafficking now relied on it to maintain control. Protection became necessity. Silence became currency. The distinction between survival and criminality blurred, not only for those at the top, but for ordinary citizens navigating scarcity. What is striking is how normalized this became. Smuggling was no longer whispered about. It was expected. Border towns reorganized around it. Coastal routes pulsed steadily at night. Entire communities depended on flows that did not appear in any ledger. Violence remained selective. The goal was still stability. Disorder threatened profits. Excess attention invited intervention. And so the system learned to operate beneath the threshold of outrage. Enough control to persist. Enough quiet to endure. International observers began to speak more openly about Venezuela's role in global trafficking during these years. Reports named networks. Investigations outlined connections. But within the country, the lived experience was more immediate. People were less concerned with labels than with food, light, and safety. As background historian, I want to pause gently here. Not to judge, but to notice. Systems that emerge in crisis often do so because something else has failed. When formal order collapses, alternative orders rush in to fill the space. They do not ask permission. As Part 4 draws to a close, the atmosphere feels dim but steady. The cartel structures we have traced are no longer hidden beneath prosperity. They are exposed by collapse, holding weight they were never meant to bear. In the quiet that follows, we will drift toward the outside world's response, where pressure, indictments, and global scrutiny begin to tighten around these systems. For now, let the night remain still, and allow this chapter to fade slowly, like a city resting during a blackout. Part 5. Eyes from afar, pressure from beyond. As the night deepens, the story turns outward. What had long moved quietly within Venezuela now begins to draw sustained attention from beyond its borders. The silence that once protected the system grows thinner, stretched by distance, diplomacy, and the slow accumulation of evidence. For years, international focus had lingered elsewhere. But by the late 2010s, patterns were becoming difficult to ignore. Seizures traced back to Venezuelan ports. Flights appeared on radar without proper documentation. Testimonies aligned across countries. What had once felt like rumor began to feel like record. The response did not arrive as a single blow. It arrived as pressure. Foreign governments began to map networks rather than chase shipments. Investigators followed money instead of boats. They studied relationships rather than routes. The picture that emerged was not of a single cartel in the traditional sense, but of an ecosystem. Military figures, political protection, traffickers, facilitators, and intermediaries all orbiting one another in slow, deliberate motion. In courtrooms far from Caracas, names were spoken aloud. Indictments were unsealed. Sanctions expanded. The language was precise, legal, and cold. It spoke of conspiracies, racketeering, and international narcotics trafficking. To those reading the documents late at night, the story felt sharp and urgent. Inside Venezuela, it felt distant. For many citizens, international pressure registered only as another tightening of daily life. Sanctions reduced access to global markets. Currency grew weaker. Shortages deepened. The illicit systems under scrutiny did not disappear. They adjusted. They grew quieter still, shifting routes, altering partners, refining methods. This is an important rhythm to notice. Pressure does not always dismantle systems. Sometimes it compresses them. The state responded by closing ranks. Loyalty became paramount. Suspicion replaced trust. Public rhetoric hardened, framing accusations as external aggression rather than internal reckoning. This posture offered protection from outside influence, but it also reinforced reliance on internal networks that could not be regulated by international law. Airspace became more controlled, but not empty. Ports became more guarded, but not closed. Smuggling adapted with patience. Smaller shipments replaced larger ones. Routes fragmented. The Caribbean, wide and forgiving, absorbed the changes without complaint. Violence, again, remained measured. The objective was survival under scrutiny. Chaos would invite intervention. Stability, even a strained one, offered cover. And so the system learned to breathe shallowly, conserving attention, minimizing noise. What strikes me most in this chapter is the contrast in perspective. From abroad, the narrative is one of confrontation and accountability. From within, it is one of endurance. Two stories unfolding simultaneously, rarely intersecting in lived experience. Ordinary people continued to navigate daily uncertainty. They waited in lines. They rationed electricity. They relied on informal networks for essentials. The grand language of indictments and sanctions felt abstract compared to the immediacy of survival. As background historian, I find this moment especially quiet, despite the global attention. The loudest conversations happened elsewhere. The deepest consequences settled at home. As Part 5 comes to a close, the sense of tension lingers, not explosive, but compressed. The world is watching now. The systems feel the gaze. Yet nothing has resolved. The structures remain, holding their breath. In the calm that follows, we will drift toward the present moment, where these pressures continue, unresolved, shaping a future that feels uncertain and unfinished. For now, let the night remain soft, and allow this chapter to settle, like distant lights flickering on a far horizon. Part 6. Life beneath the system. As we move softly onward, the story lowers its voice. After courts and sanctions, maps and accusations, we return to ground level, where history is not debated but lived. This part is not about organizations or indictments. It is about daily motion, about how a country continues to breathe while carrying an invisible weight. In Venezuela, life did not stop when attention turned outward. It narrowed. It adapted. It learned new rhythms that were quieter and more careful than before. In neighborhoods across the country, people rose early, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. Lines formed before dawn. Conversation stayed low. Trust became selective. When formal systems falter, people do not wait for solutions. They build workarounds. Informal economies expanded, not as rebellion, but as survival. Goods moved hand to hand. Information traveled faster than paperwork. Knowing the right person mattered more than knowing the rules. The same routes that once seemed distant, associated with drugs and geopolitics, now touched everyday life. A fisherman who once sold only his catch now ferried fuel. A driver who once hauled produce now carried medicine across checkpoints. These roles were rarely celebrated. They were accepted. They existed in a grey space where morality was shaped by hunger and responsibility rather than ideology. This is where the presence of cartel structures becomes most subtle. They do not always announce themselves through violence or fear. Often, they exist as background gravity. They shape what is possible without being seen. They determine which roads remain open, which ports stay active, which borders feel passable. For many Venezuelans, the drug trade was not something they encountered directly. It was something they felt indirectly. Through scarcity. Through silence. Through the sense that some things could not be spoken aloud, even among friends. This quiet awareness settled into daily life like humidity, always present, rarely acknowledged. What fascinates me here is how normality persists. Children still played in streets at dusk. Music still drifted from open windows. Celebration still happened, scaled down but sincere. Life insisted on continuing, even when the structures above it felt brittle. The state, too, continued its routines. Schools opened when they could. Offices operated when power allowed. Public messages emphasized resilience and sovereignty. These gestures mattered. They offered continuity in a time when many certainties had dissolved. And yet, beneath this surface, the parallel systems remained active. Trafficking networks did not disappear. They adjusted their visibility. They blended further into existing flows of smuggling and trade. Drugs moved alongside fuel. Cash moved alongside food. The boundaries between legal and illegal blurred until they felt almost theoretical. Violence remained uneven. Some regions felt it sharply. Others barely at all. The absence of widespread chaos was not accidental. It reflected a shared understanding among those who benefited from the system that disorder was bad for business. Stability, even a fragile one, allowed everything else to continue. This does not mean people were unaware. Awareness existed. It lived in glances, in pauses, in the way conversations changed direction. It lived in jokes that carried too much truth. It lived in the choice to focus on family, on immediate concerns, on what could be controlled. As background historian, I find this layer of history the quietest and the most human. It reminds us that large systems do not only shape borders and markets. They shape mornings and evenings. They shape what people hope for and what they stop expecting. As Part 6 comes to a close, let this softness remain. Not as comfort, but as understanding. The story of cartels in Venezuela is not only a story of power and profit. It is a story of people learning how to live beneath forces they did not choose. In the stillness that follows, we will begin to look at how these systems project outward again, influencing migration, regional stability, and the wider hemisphere. For now, let the night stay calm, and allow this chapter to fade gently, like lights dimming in a quiet neighborhood. Part 7. Leaving, carrying, and the routes beyond. As the night moves forward, the story begins to travel. What once stayed within borders now drifts outward, carried not only by boats and aircraft, but by people themselves. This chapter is quieter than headlines, yet expansive, stretching far beyond Venezuela into the wider region. When daily life becomes narrow and uncertain, movement becomes a form of hope. Over time, millions of Venezuelans began to leave, not all at once, but steadily, like water seeping through cracks. Some crossed west into Colombia, others moved south toward Brazil, or north toward the Caribbean. Each journey carried personal reasons, but together they reshaped the continent's human geography. Migration routes, like trafficking routes, favor familiarity. People followed paths that already existed. Border crossings known for flexibility. Coastal towns accustomed to quiet departures. Jungle trails that had long served commerce of every kind. The overlap was not intentional, but it was unavoidable. The same spaces that allowed illicit trade to move smoothly also allowed people to pass when official systems failed them. This is where the drug trade and migration brush against one another, not as partners, but as cohabitants of the same terrain. Smugglers offered transport to families alongside contraband. Boats carried people and packages under the same stars. Payments were made in cash, in labor, in trust. The lines between facilitator and trafficker blurred, not because people sought crime, but because structure had disappeared. For neighboring countries, this created strain. Border towns expanded rapidly. Informal camps formed. Services stretched thin. Governments responded with varying degrees of openness and caution. Some welcomed migrants. Others tightened controls. None were untouched. The cartel systems we have traced adapted again. Migration offered cover. It offered volume. It offered distraction. Larger flows made smaller movements harder to detect. And yet, these systems also depended on restraint. Exploitation brought attention. Excess violence disrupted routes. The balance remained delicate. What strikes me here is the shared quiet of movement. People rarely left with ceremony. Goodbyes were brief. Bags were light. Documents were incomplete. Hope was carried more heavily than possessions. Many believed they would return. Some still do. Within Venezuela, departure reshaped communities. Neighborhoods thinned. Families stretched across borders. Remittances replaced wages. Communication became digital, delayed, and precious. The country did not empty, but it changed texture, becoming a place of absences as much as presences. For those who stayed, the routes outward were reminders. They marked both loss and possibility. They traced paths that others had walked successfully, even if painfully. The knowledge that leaving was possible altered how people thought about the future. As background historian, I find this chapter especially hushed. Movement does not always announce itself. It leaves traces rather than monuments. Empty rooms. Quiet bus stations. Messages sent late at night across borders. As Part 7 comes to a close, let this sense of outward drift settle gently. The systems we have followed are no longer contained within one nation. They ripple across the region, shaping lives far from their origins. In the stillness that follows, we will turn toward how these dynamics affect neighboring countries and the broader hemisphere, where Venezuela's story becomes part of a larger, interconnected pattern. For now, let the night remain calm, and allow this chapter to fade like footsteps disappearing down a long road. Part 8. Ripples across the region. As we drift onward, the story widens again, like circles spreading across still water. What began within Venezuela no longer belongs to Venezuela alone. The roots, the pressures, the adaptations now touch coastlines, borders, and cities far beyond its own horizon. In the Caribbean, the sea remains calm and indifferent, carrying everything placed upon it. Small islands and coastal nations feel the movement first. Boats arrive quietly. Cargo changes hands without ceremony. Local economies, already fragile, absorb new flows of money and risk. What passes through Venezuela does not stop there. It continues, guided by currents and convenience rather than flags. To the west, Colombia adjusts its own balance. Long familiar with the weight of the drug trade, it now shares responsibility for routes that bend and reroute around pressure. Cooperation and tension exist side by side. Borders become spaces of negotiation, not just between governments, but between systems operating in parallel. Further north, Central America feels the strain. Transit nations become holding nations. Smuggling corridors overlap with migrant pathways. Local gangs and international networks intersect briefly, then move on. Each place touched absorbs a fragment of the larger story, reshaping it according to local conditions. What is remarkable is how adaptable these systems remain. When one route grows risky, another opens. When scrutiny increases, scale decreases. When violence draws attention, silence becomes strategy. The drug trade does not move like an army. It moves like water, filling the spaces left available. Regional governments respond unevenly. Some strengthen enforcement. Others negotiate quietly. Many do both at once. International cooperation expands, yet sovereignty complicates coordination. Information is shared, but action lags. The system persists not because it is unstoppable, but because it is patient. For ordinary people across the region, these dynamics feel distant and immediate at the same time. News reports mention seizures and arrests. Daily life reflects rising prices, crowded cities, and stretched services. The connection is rarely stated outright, but it is felt. As background historian, I often think about how history moves sideways as much as forward. Decisions made in one place create consequences elsewhere, sometimes years later, sometimes overnight. Venezuela's transformation altered regional rhythms, not dramatically, but steadily, like a tide that changes the shoreline without announcement. Within Venezuela, awareness of this outward influence grows quietly. The country is no longer just enduring its own crisis. It has become a node in a wider network, its internal struggles mirrored in neighboring spaces. This awareness carries a quiet weight, a sense of being both central and constrained. As Part 8 comes to a close, let this expanded view rest gently in your thoughts. The story is no longer confined to borders or governments. It lives in roots, in adaptations, in the shared stillness of places touched by the same unseen currents. In the calm that follows, we will begin to turn inward once more, reflecting on how memory, denial, and normalization shape how societies live with systems that refuse to disappear. For now, let the night remain wide and quiet, and allow this chapter to fade like distant lights along a long coastline. Part 9. Living with what does not leave. As the night settles even more deeply, the story turns inward, toward memory and habit, toward the quiet ways a society learns to live beside something that never fully departs. By this point, the systems we have traced are no longer new, nor shocking. They have become familiar shapes in the background of life in Venezuela, present without always being named. This is how endurance often looks. Not resistance, not acceptance, but normalization. When a situation persists long enough, people stop waiting for it to end. They adjust their expectations. Conversations shift from why to how. How to move safely. How to find what is needed. How to raise children inside uncertainty without letting uncertainty define them. In neighborhoods across the country, people learned what not to ask. Silence became a form of knowledge. Everyone understood which topics carried weight, which names should not be spoken casually, which questions led nowhere good. This was not always fear. Often, it was practicality. Energy was finite, and it was spent on what could be controlled. Institutions reflected this adaptation as well. Schools taught when they could. Hospitals improvised. Local officials focused on managing rather than fixing. The idea of restoration slowly gave way to the idea of continuity. Keeping things from getting worse became its own achievement. The drug trade, in this context, existed like background weather. It shaped conditions without demanding constant attention. Most people never saw it directly. They felt it through its consequences. Through the quiet confidence of some and the quiet exhaustion of others. Through the sense that certain paths were open and others were closed, for reasons that were never fully explained. Memory plays a subtle role here. For those old enough to remember a different Venezuela, the contrast lingered. Stories were told softly about the past. About stability. About plans that once felt possible. For younger generations, this environment was simply the world as it had always been. They learned its rules intuitively, without comparison. What strikes me as background historian is how little drama accompanies this stage of history. There are no turning points here. No decisive moments. Only continuation. Only the steady layering of days that resemble one another closely enough to blur. This normalization does not mean indifference. Beneath the calm, emotions run deep. Frustration. Grief. Resilience. Humor. All coexist, woven into daily life. People laugh more quietly. Celebrate more carefully. Hope in smaller, more immediate ways. The state, too, leans into routine. Public messaging emphasizes strength and endurance. The future is spoken of in broad, distant terms. The present is managed in detail. This approach offers stability of a kind, even as it avoids deeper reckoning. And yet, normalization has a cost. When systems become invisible, they become harder to challenge. When survival depends on adaptation, imagination narrows. Change begins to feel abstract, almost impolite to expect. As Part 9 comes to a close, sit gently with this idea. Not everything that persists does so because it is accepted. Some things persist because people learn how to live around them, like furniture too heavy to move, shaping the room without ever being chosen. In the stillness that follows, we will begin to look toward moments where this quiet balance is tested, when pressure builds enough to disturb even the most carefully maintained routines. For now, let the night remain soft, and allow this chapter to fade slowly, like a familiar street settling into darkness. Part 10. When the quiet begins to strain. As we move gently into the next chapter, the night feels different now. Still calm, still hushed, but carrying a faint tension beneath its surface, like air before a distant storm. The long period of adjustment we have been resting in does not break suddenly, but it does begin to stretch, and stretching has its limits. In Venezuela, even the most carefully maintained routines occasionally falter. Scarcity deepens, patience thins, and moments arise when the unspoken rules no longer hold quite as firmly. These moments do not always arrive with shouting or crowds. Often, they arrive as pauses, as hesitation, as the sense that something familiar is beginning to feel unsustainable. Public expressions of frustration appear and disappear like passing clouds. A protest forms, then dissolves. A neighborhood goes dark longer than expected. A checkpoint tightens unexpectedly. None of these events alone signals transformation. But together, they create pressure, pressing gently but persistently against the systems that rely on quiet cooperation. For those who benefit from illicit stability, this is a delicate time. Too much force invites attention. Too little invites disorder. The balance becomes harder to maintain as conditions worsen. What once felt manageable now requires constant adjustment, constant calibration. The state responds by emphasizing control. Presence increases. Authority becomes more visible. Uniforms, vehicles, and patrols occupy spaces once left alone. This visibility reassures some and unsettles others. It reminds everyone that order, however strained, is still being asserted. And yet, beneath this surface, the parallel systems remain active. Routes continue to function. Trade continues to move. The drug networks do not vanish under pressure. They adapt to it, just as they have adapted to everything else. Smaller movements replace larger ones. Familiar faces replace anonymous exchanges. Silence grows thicker. For ordinary people, these moments of strain are felt emotionally before they are understood intellectually. Fatigue settles deeper. Hope becomes cautious. Plans shrink. People learn to read the mood of the city, the tone of announcements, the behavior of authorities, adjusting daily life accordingly. What fascinates me here is how restraint persists. Even as tension rises, there is a shared understanding that chaos benefits no one. Violence remains contained, not absent, but measured. The systems that have grown over decades understand that survival depends on remaining unremarkable. History often teaches us to look for explosions. But many transformations happen through pressure alone. Through the slow realization that a balance once maintained with ease now requires constant effort. As background historian, I sense this chapter as a long breath being held. Not yet released. Not yet broken. Just sustained, day after day, with growing difficulty. As part 10 comes to a close, let this quiet tension settle beside you. The story has reached a midpoint, not of resolution, but of strain. The future is still unwritten, but the present is heavy with the work of holding things together. In the stillness that follows, we will drift into how uncertainty shapes imagination, especially among those who must decide whether to stay, to leave, or simply to endure. For now, let the night remain calm, and allow this chapter to fade like distant thunder that has not yet arrived. Part 11. Choosing without certainty. As the night carries us forward, the tension we sensed before softens into something more reflective. This part is shaped not by events, but by decisions. Quiet ones. Personal ones. The kind made without certainty, often without words. In Venezuela, many people live suspended between options that do not fully exist. Stay or leave. Wait or act. Hope or adapt. These choices are rarely clear and almost never final. They are revisited again and again, reshaped by circumstance, by family, by exhaustion. For some, leaving feels inevitable. Not dramatic, not defiant, but practical. A calculation made late at night, whispered between partners, written in lists that never quite feel complete. Routes are researched quietly. Messages are sent to friends abroad. Bags are packed, unpacked, and packed again. For others, staying feels equally deliberate. Roots run deep. Responsibilities hold firm. Elderly parents. Children in school. A belief, sometimes stubborn, sometimes tender, that endurance itself is meaningful. Staying becomes an act of care, even when it is heavy. These decisions unfold beneath the larger systems we have traced. The drug trade, the state, the pressure from abroad. All of it forms the backdrop against which personal futures are imagined. But rarely do people name these forces directly. They speak instead of jobs, safety, distance, and time. The quiet power of normalization shows itself here. When uncertainty becomes routine, imagination narrows. People plan shorter futures. Weeks instead of years. Practical goals instead of distant dreams. This is not surrender. It is adaptation. What strikes me most is how often people carry both choices at once. Someone may prepare to leave while still investing in staying. A passport renewed. A garden tended. A phone number saved abroad. A room repainted at home. Life held in suspension, balanced carefully between possibilities. The systems that benefit from silence continue to rely on this inward focus. When attention is spent on survival and choice, there is little left for confrontation. Not because people do not care, but because caring is already exhausting. And yet, beneath this quiet narrowing, something else persists. A sense of self, of humor, of identity that refuses to dissolve completely into circumstance. People joke about difficulty. They share food when there is little. They celebrate milestones softly but sincerely. As background historian, I find this chapter especially intimate. It reminds us that history does not only happen in palaces or ports. It happens in kitchens, in bus stations, in the long pauses before sleep when tomorrow is considered one more time. As part 11 comes to a close, let this sense of suspended choice rest gently with you. Not everything unresolved is unstable. Sometimes, it is simply waiting. In the stillness that follows, we will turn toward how time itself reshapes these decisions, how years of adaptation begin to harden into identity, both personal and national. For now, let the night remain quiet, and allow this chapter to fade like a bus pulling away into the dark, neither rushed nor delayed. Part 12. Time becomes the landscape. As the night slowly thins toward early morning, the story settles into something even quieter. This part is shaped by time, not as a measurement, but as an environment. What once felt temporary has lingered long enough to become familiar. Adaptation, repeated daily, begins to feel like identity. In Venezuela, years of uncertainty have reshaped how people understand themselves and one another. Children grow up knowing routines that their parents still think of as adjustments. Shortages, improvisation, careful speech, and informal exchange are not disruptions to normal life. They are normal life. This is how time works in prolonged strain. It smooths sharp edges. It dulls urgency. It teaches people how to move through difficulty with less friction. What once demanded explanation no longer does. It is simply how things are. Communities reorganize around this understanding. Schools adapt their schedules. Families plan gatherings around electricity. Celebrations become smaller, more intimate. Pride shifts from accumulation to endurance. From expansion to continuity. The systems beneath all of this continue their quiet presence. The drug routes remain active. The networks remain intact. But they are rarely spoken of directly. They are part of the landscape now, like mountains or rivers. Known. Avoided. Accepted without endorsement. What is remarkable is how this long duration reshapes memory. The past begins to feel distant, almost theoretical. Stories of stability sound like folklore. Younger generations listen politely, without resentment, but also without longing for something they never experienced. Hope changes shape here. It becomes practical. It focuses on small improvements rather than sweeping change. A reliable routine. A safe neighborhood. A child's education. These goals carry weight because they are achievable within constraints. As background historian, I am always struck by how societies learn to live inside conditions that outsiders still describe as crises. From within, it feels less like emergency and more like weather. Something to prepare for rather than solve. This does not mean dissatisfaction disappears. It means it becomes quieter, more internal. Expressed through decisions rather than demands. Through movement or stillness. Through staying, leaving, or waiting a little longer. As part 12 comes to a close, let this sense of time settling into place rest gently with you. Not everything that endures does so because it is just. Some things endure because people learn how to live around them. In the calm that follows, we will begin to explore how narratives are shaped from this long experience. How stories are told, denied, softened, or preserved. For now, let the night remain calm, and allow this chapter to fade like early light spreading slowly across familiar ground. Part 13. The stories that are told. As we drift onward, the night invites us to listen more closely. This chapter is about narrative, about which stories rise to the surface and which remain folded quietly away. When time stretches long, societies learn not only how to live, but how to explain living. In Venezuela, stories are shaped carefully. Public language favors endurance, dignity, and sovereignty. Official speeches speak of resilience. Broadcasts emphasize unity. These narratives do not always deny hardship. Instead, they frame it as something shared, something to be carried together. At the same time, other stories circulate more softly. They travel through kitchens, taxis, messages sent late at night. They are told without microphones or headlines. These stories focus on workarounds, on who can be trusted, on what has changed quietly and what has not changed at all. The drug trade exists differently within these parallel narratives. In official spaces, it is distant, framed as an external accusation or a foreign obsession. In private spaces, it is understood as background reality. Not discussed in detail, but acknowledged through implication. A pause. A lowered voice. A knowing look. This selective storytelling serves a purpose. It preserves a sense of normalcy. It allows daily life to proceed without constant confrontation. Naming everything explicitly would require energy, and energy is already scarce. Media plays a delicate role here. Journalists work within constraints that are both formal and informal. Some stories are softened. Others are delayed. Many are never written. This is not always the result of direct orders. Often, it is anticipation. Knowing what will not be welcomed. Knowing what will bring consequences. And yet, memory resists full control. People remember what they have seen. They remember when routes changed, when prices shifted, when certain figures gained influence quietly. These memories are shared selectively, passed on to those who need them. As background historian, I find this layering of narrative deeply human. Societies do not lie to themselves without reason. They simplify, not to deceive, but to cope. Complexity can overwhelm. Simpler stories create space to breathe. The cost of this simplification is subtle. Over time, what is unnamed becomes harder to address. When systems operate without language, they slip further from accountability. They become part of the background hum, present but rarely questioned. Younger generations inherit these narratives already shaped. They learn what can be said publicly and what belongs only in trusted company. This knowledge becomes cultural, absorbed without instruction. As Part 13 comes to a close, let this idea settle gently. History is not only what happens. It is what is said about what happens, and what remains unsaid. In the stillness that follows, we will turn toward how these stories are carried forward, into memory, into identity, and into the future that waits quietly beyond the present moment. For now, let the night remain calm, and allow this chapter to fade like a radio turned low, still playing somewhere in the dark. Part 14. What is passed along? As the night continues, the story becomes even softer, almost intimate. This part is not about systems or movement, but about inheritance. Not money or land, but understanding. What is remembered? What is warned about? What is quietly passed from one generation to the next? In Venezuela, much of what is known is not written down. It lives in tone and timing. In advice offered casually, then repeated later with more seriousness. Children learn early how to read a room, how to sense when a question should not be asked, how to recognize which paths are easier and which are better left alone. Older generations carry memories of contrast. They remember when things felt more predictable, when futures could be planned further ahead. These memories are shared carefully, not to burden, but to explain. To offer context for why certain precautions exist, why certain silences matter. Stories are told around tables late in the evening. Not dramatic stories. Practical ones. Who once worked where? Which border crossing used to be simpler? Which times of year were easier? These details sound ordinary, but they are maps, quietly guiding the next generation through a complicated landscape. The presence of cartel systems is rarely named directly in these conversations. Instead, it appears through implication. A warning to avoid a certain area. A reminder to keep documents ready. A suggestion to leave early or not at all. Knowledge encoded as care. What is striking is how responsibility shifts downward. Children learn not only how to survive, but how to protect others from worry. They speak cautiously to elders. They filter information. They become stewards of calm, even while carrying uncertainty themselves. This passing of understanding creates continuity, but it also creates weight. When caution becomes inherited, risk feels permanent. The idea that things could change begins to feel abstract, almost impolite to expect. As background historian, I often pause here, because this is where history stops feeling like something that happened and starts feeling like something that lives. In habits, in phrases, in the way people glance before speaking. Yet even here, warmth persists. Laughter still fills rooms. Stories drift toward humor. Families find ways to celebrate quietly, meaningfully. Life is not defined solely by constraint. It expands wherever it can. As part 14 draws to a close, let this sense of inheritance rest gently with you. History is not only preserved in archives and reports. It is carried in voices, in warnings, in love shaped by experience. In the stillness that follows, we will begin to look ahead, toward how these inherited understandings influence what people imagine for the future, and whether imagination itself begins to stretch again. For now, let the night remain calm, and allow this chapter to fade like an old photograph returned carefully to its place. Part 15. Imagining forward, carefully. As the night stretches on, the story turns its gaze ahead, not with urgency, but with caution. This chapter lives in the space between what has been endured and what might still be possible. It is about imagination, not as fantasy, but as a quiet, deliberate act. In Venezuela, imagining the future requires balance. Too much hope can feel fragile. Too little can feel heavy. And so people learn to imagine carefully, testing ideas gently before holding them too closely. For some, the future is imagined elsewhere. A city across a border. A coastline further north. A place where routines feel lighter and plans can stretch further ahead. These imagined futures are practical rather than idealized. They include work, stability, and rest. Nothing extravagant. Just room to breathe. For others, the future is imagined right where they stand. A belief that change does not always arrive dramatically, that it can come quietly, through small openings and gradual repair. This imagination is slower, rooted in familiarity, shaped by the knowledge that leaving is not the only form of movement. Young people carry this tension most visibly. They grow up fluent in adaptation, skilled at navigating uncertainty, yet still curious about possibility. Their ambitions are not extinguished, but they are calibrated. Careers are chosen for flexibility. Education is pursued with an eye toward portability. Dreams are held lightly, ready to move if needed. The systems we have traced remain part of this forward thinking, even when unspoken. Roots, networks, and power structures shape what feels realistic. People do not imagine futures that require dismantling everything at once. They imagine futures that fit around what already exists. This is not resignation. It is realism shaped by experience. As background historian, I find this moment quietly profound. History often portrays hope as loud, declarative, and immediate. But here, hope is restrained. It speaks softly. It waits for conditions that feel safe enough to trust. In conversations late at night, people talk about timing, about watching and waiting, about knowing when to act and when to remain still. These conversations rarely resolve into decisions. They remain open, revisited again and again as circumstances shift. Even the idea of return becomes part of this careful imagination. Those who leave imagine coming back someday. Those who stay imagine welcoming them. These imagined reunions are not scheduled. They exist as reassurance, as proof that distance is not always final. As part 15 comes to a close, let this gentle forward gaze rest with you. The future here is not abandoned, nor seized aggressively. It is held, patiently, shaped by memory and caution, waiting for moments that feel solid enough to stand on. In the calm that follows, we will begin to reflect on what it means for a country to carry such layered histories at once, and how identity itself evolves under long pressure. For now, let the night remain still, and allow this chapter to fade like the first hint of dawn, present but not yet demanding the day. Part 16. Who we become while waiting. As the night moves gently onward, the story settles into identity. Not identity as a slogan or a symbol, but as something shaped slowly, through repetition and response. This part is about who people become while living inside long uncertainty, and how a country learns to recognize itself anew. In Venezuela, identity has not disappeared under pressure. It has condensed. Certain traits have grown sharper, more visible. Resourcefulness. Humor that survives difficulty. A deep attentiveness to others. These qualities are not romantic responses to hardship. They are practical ones. People learn to read nuance. To notice shifts in tone, in timing, in mood. This attentiveness becomes social intelligence, passed quietly from one interaction to the next. It allows communities to function even when formal systems feel unreliable. It allows trust to exist in small, carefully chosen circles. Culture adapts alongside this identity. Music, art, and conversation do not ignore reality, but they rarely confront it head-on. Instead, they circle it. Metaphor replaces declaration. Color replaces argument. A mural speaks where a statement cannot. A song carries weight without naming its source. What fascinates me here is how pride persists, even under strain. Not pride in conditions, but pride in endurance. In having made it through another day without losing warmth or generosity. This pride is quiet, internal, and deeply personal. The presence of cartel systems remains part of the background shaping identity, even when unnamed. People define themselves not by these systems, but in contrast to them. Through care for family. Through mutual aid. Through an insistence on normalcy where possible. This creates a layered sense of self. One layer adapts to constraint. Another preserves memory. Another still imagines something beyond both. Identity becomes flexible, capable of holding contradiction without breaking. As background historian, I often reflect on how long periods of pressure reshape not only institutions, but temperament. They teach patience. They teach caution. They also teach empathy, because nearly everyone is carrying something unseen. This identity does not announce itself to the world loudly. It reveals itself in gestures, in shared meals, in laughter that arrives unexpectedly, in the refusal to let difficulty erase dignity. As part 16 comes to a close, let this sense of becoming rest gently with you. History is not only a sequence of events. It is a slow shaping of character, both individual and collective. In the stillness that follows, we will turn toward how outside narratives and inside identities meet, and sometimes clash, shaping how Venezuela is seen and how it sees itself. For now, let the night remain calm, and allow this chapter to fade like music echoing softly from a distant street. Part 17. How others see, how home feels. As the night continues its slow passage, the story turns toward reflection, toward the space where outside perception meets inner reality. This chapter rests in that quiet tension between how a country is described and how it is lived. Beyond Venezuela, the narrative often arrives in fragments. Headlines speak of crisis, cartels, collapse. Images focus on shortages, indictments, departures. These portrayals are not false, but they are narrow. They flatten a complex experience into symbols that travel easily across screens. For those watching from afar, Venezuela becomes an idea more than a place. A warning. A case study. A headline revisited whenever the world needs an example of failure or excess. In these stories, systems loom large. Names are repeated. Context is compressed. Inside the country, these portrayals feel distant, even when they describe real hardship. People recognize pieces of their lives in them, but rarely the whole. They do not see their daily negotiations reflected. Their humor. Their restraint. Their quiet acts of care. This disconnect creates a subtle divide. People grow accustomed to being misunderstood. Not out of resentment, but out of familiarity. They learn that explanation is tiring and rarely complete. That lived experience resists translation. The drug trade exists differently across this divide. From outside, it dominates the story, framed as cause and consequence. From inside, it remains background influence, present but rarely central in daily thought. Life is shaped more by scarcity, by family, by time, than by any single system. As background historian, I find this contrast revealing. History is often written from distance. It values clarity over texture. It prefers events to atmospheres. But atmosphere is where people live. When these outside narratives return home through media, they are received quietly. Sometimes with agreement. Sometimes with frustration. Often with resignation. People know what is missing. They know what cannot be shown easily. This awareness shapes identity further. It encourages inward focus. It reinforces the value of local understanding over global explanation. Truth becomes something shared among those who live it, rather than something broadcast. And yet, there is also a quiet hope that one day, the story will be told more fully. With space for nuance. With room for humanity. Not as a spectacle, but as a lived history. As Part 17 comes to a close, let this meeting of perspectives rest gently. How a place is seen is never the same as how it feels. Both matter. Both shape what comes next. In the stillness that follows, we will drift toward a wider reflection, considering what it means for histories like this to remain unresolved, and how uncertainty itself becomes part of the story's legacy. For now, let the night remain calm, and allow this chapter to fade like a television screen dimming in a quiet room. Part 18. An ending that has not arrived. As the night deepens toward its quietest hour, the story slows even further. This chapter does not offer resolution, because none has come. Instead, it rests with uncertainty, with the understanding that some histories do not conclude cleanly. They simply continue, changing shape as they go. In Venezuela, the systems we have traced remain present. Not frozen, not static, but persistent. Roots shift. Pressures fluctuate. Attention from the outside rises and falls. Yet nothing arrives to signal an ending. No clear break. No decisive turning of the page. This absence of conclusion becomes part of the story itself. People learn to live without waiting for closure. They stop asking when things will end and begin asking how things will be navigated tomorrow. Time becomes less about milestones and more about endurance. The drug trade, woven quietly through the narrative, continues its subdued rhythm. It does not dominate daily life, but it shapes conditions. It exists as a constant influence rather than an active drama. Like a low current beneath still water, it moves steadily, rarely seen, always felt. For those who have left, this lack of resolution keeps ties alive. Return remains possible, even if distant. For those who stay, it reinforces patience. The belief that change, if it comes, will come slowly, without ceremony. As background historian, I find something honest in this open ending. History often resists neat conclusions. The desire for resolution belongs more to observers than to those living within events. Life rarely pauses for summaries. What remains instead is continuity. Memory layered over experience. Identity shaped by waiting. A country learning to exist without a clear horizon, yet still moving forward, step by step. As Part 18 comes to a close, let this sense of unfinished time rest gently with you. Not everything unresolved is broken. Some things are simply still unfolding. In the stillness that follows, we will turn toward reflection rather than conclusion, considering what it means to carry such a history forward, and how rest itself becomes an act of preservation. For now, let the night remain calm, and allow this chapter to fade like stars dimming before dawn, not gone, just receding. Part 19. Carrying the weight forward. As the night begins to loosen its hold, we arrive at a chapter that feels almost weightless, not because the burden has lifted, but because it has been carried for so long. This is the hour when reflection settles naturally, when effort gives way to endurance, and endurance becomes habit. In Venezuela, the past does not sit behind the present. It walks alongside it. The years of quiet adjustment, the systems that never fully announce themselves, the choices made without certainty, all continue to shape each new day. Nothing has resolved, yet nothing is frozen. What remains most striking is how people learn to hold complexity without demanding answers from it. Life moves forward not because clarity arrives, but because movement itself becomes necessary. Work is done. Care is given. Mornings come, regardless of whether questions have been answered. The structures tied to the drug trade remain part of this weight. They have not vanished, nor have they overtaken everything. They exist as one influence among many, shaping conditions rather than commanding attention. Over time, their presence becomes something navigated rather than confronted, acknowledged rather than analyzed. This does not mean awareness fades. It means it matures. People understand the landscape they live in. They recognize where power rests, where silence is safer, where opportunity may still exist. This understanding is not cynical. It is practical. Across communities, there is a quiet dignity in this carrying. Not pride in hardship, but pride in continuity. In having endured without losing tenderness. In having adapted without surrendering identity. As background historian, I often find that this stage of history is overlooked. It lacks spectacle. It resists summary. Yet it is here that societies reveal their deepest character. Not in moments of collapse or triumph, but in the long middle where life continues without guarantees. Memory remains active. Stories are still told. Lessons are still passed along. But they are held lightly now, integrated into daily rhythm rather than treated as warnings. The weight of the past does not crush the present. It steadies it. As part 19 draws to a close, let this sense of quiet carrying rest with you. History does not always demand action. Sometimes, it asks only to be lived with care. In the stillness that follows, we will move into our final chapter, not to close the story, but to lay it down gently, offering rest rather than resolution. For now, let the night soften further, and allow this chapter to fade like early light settling into familiar streets. Part 20. Laying the story down. As we arrive at the final chapter of this long night, the world feels hushed in a different way. Not tense. Not heavy. Simply still. This is the hour when stories do not end, but rest. When they are set down gently, allowed to remain unfinished without being unresolved. The history we have traced through Venezuela has never moved in straight lines. It has curved and slowed, hidden itself, resurfaced, and softened again. Drug routes, power structures, endurance, silence, and daily life have all flowed together, shaping a reality that cannot be reduced to a single explanation. What remains most clearly is not the presence of cartels, nor the absence of resolution, but the way life continues alongside both. People wake. Streets fill quietly. Families adapt their routines. Meaning is found not in clarity, but in continuity. This is not a story of villains and heroes. It is a story of systems and people sharing the same space. Of forces that persist and lives that learn how to move among them. Of patience becoming a skill, and restraint becoming a form of wisdom. As background historian, I want to leave you with this gentle truth. History does not always resolve itself within our telling. Some chapters remain open because they are still being lived. To demand a conclusion would be to misunderstand the nature of time. Venezuela's story, like many others, carries forward quietly. Not erased. Not finished. Simply ongoing. And within that ongoingness exists humor, care, identity, and hope that speaks softly rather than loudly. So here, at the edge of dawn, we set the story down without closing it. We allow it to rest, just as you are invited to rest now. There is nothing more you need to hold on to. Nothing more you need to solve. The night has done its work. The story has been carried. And in this calm, unfinished space, it is enough to simply let go. And now, as the story settles fully into silence, we arrive at the place where words are no longer meant to carry weight. The night has unfolded gently, chapter by chapter, not to persuade or conclude, but simply to accompany you through a long and complicated history. We traced roots and pauses, power and patience, movement and stillness, all within the unfolding life of Venezuela. We did not rush. We did not demand answers. We allowed the story to remain what it is, lived, ongoing, and deeply human. If there is anything to carry with you from this telling, let it be this. History is not only made by moments of force or resolution. It is made by endurance. By mornings that arrive without clarity. By evenings where people choose care over despair. By lives that continue, quietly, beneath systems they did not design. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to hold on to names or timelines. The purpose of this story was never to sharpen the mind, but to soften it. To offer understanding without urgency. To let complexity exist without demanding that you untangle it. As background historian, I am grateful that you shared this quiet time with me. In the hush of listening, history becomes something gentler. Less a lesson, more a landscape. Something you can pass through slowly, without fear of getting lost. Now, you are free to rest. Let the voices fade. Let the images dim. Let the night do what it does best, hold you without asking anything in return. If sleep comes, welcome it. If wakefulness lingers, let it linger softly. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for allowing this story to unfold at its own unhurried pace. The world will still be there when you wake. For now, there is nothing more to follow, nothing more to carry. Rest easily. The story is laid down.